They thought they buried me under shame and silence. What they didn't know is that I learned to grow roots in the dark. My name is Victoria Lane, and for most of my life, I was the family's inconvenient truth, the adopted daughter of a legacy bloodline who never quite fit into their polished world. When I left the Ashcroft mansion 10 years ago, I didn't just walk out the front door. I walked away from the wealth, the control, and the Cold War that masqueraded as family dinners. That day, I shed more than just a last name. I buried Victoria Ashcroft, the girl who waited for affection that never came, who tried to earn her place in a bloodline that saw her as a stain. And in her place, I created someone new, Victoria Lane, a name with no legacy, no ties, no expectations, just grit. They didn't know her, but they would. They thought I vanished, that I failed, that I'd come crawling back one day. But last week, something unexpected arrived. A cream-colored envelope, thick with embossed gold lettering and old money arrogance. Inside was an invitation to dinner at the Ashcroft estate. It was signed by a name I hadn't said aloud in years, Evelyn Ashcroft, the family matriarch, and the woman who raised me after my mother died. She was never truly my mother, but she never let me forget that either. I ran my fingers along the edges of the card. Still sharp, still cold. You are cordially invited to the Ashcroft family autumn dinner. Cordially, as if nothing had happened, as if the humiliation, the exile, the whispered disownment had all been a misunderstanding over coffee. To them, I was the girl who disappeared into some Brooklyn apartment, probably working freelance or doing something creative. I could practically hear Evelyn clinking her wine glass, offering her trademark smirk as she murmured to her guests, "Victoria? Oh, darling, she's finding herself." Yes, I found myself. And something else, too. Over the past 10 years, I'd built a business empire behind closed doors, quiet investments, masked identities, and strategic silence. I'd become the majority stakeholder in West Pine Holdings, the firm quietly acquiring prime assets across Manhattan, including Ashcroft Plaza, the family's crown jewel. So when I accepted that invitation, it wasn't for nostalgia, it was for reckoning. I was going back, not as the lost girl they dismissed, but as the woman who now owned the floor beneath their feet. Sunday came quicker than I expected. The car ride back to the Ashcroft estate was strangely quiet, just the sound of tires humming along the long driveway I hadn't seen in 10 years. My fingers tapped against the window as I stared at the same iron gates that once felt like prison bars. I could have turned back, but I didn't. I was no longer the girl they buried in silence. As the butler opened the door and led me inside, I felt the old chill return, the kind that never came from the weather, but from the people who called this place home. The clink of crystal glasses and the soft hum of a string quartet filled the dining hall, but none of it could drown out the chill in the air. As I stepped into the grand room, draped in golden chandeliers and false warmth, I knew exactly what to expect. Evelyn Ashcroft, my mother, stood at the far end of the table. Regal as ever in her ivory silk dress, she wore her disapproval like a perfume, subtle but suffocating. Her eyes swept over me once, cool and clinical, before she offered a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Victoria," she said, as if saying my name tasted bitter. "I see you finally remembered where home is." Behind her, my older brother Preston lounged in his seat, swirling red wine like a smug prince returned from battle. He didn't bother to stand. "Still dressing like you're one scandal away from a headline," he chuckled. And then there was Cassandra, my sister-in-law by title, but never by affection. She once called me that stray girl your brother keeps pitying. Her laugh was sharp as glass. "We were just talking about you, Victoria. Isn't it funny how some people vanish, and yet still manage to find their way back when they smell money?" Each word hit like a slap, soft enough to deny malice, sharp enough to draw old blood. But I didn't flinch. Not this time. I took my seat slowly, my gaze steady. I had learned the art of silence. Not the kind that submits, but the kind that watches and remembers. As they performed their little theater of contempt, I scanned the room. The same family portraits lined the walls, faces of pride, legacy, power. I used to believe I didn't belong in any of them. But now I understood. This wasn't about belonging. This was about reclaiming. Evelyn raised her glass for a toast, voice honeyed with passive aggression. To family! No matter how far some of us may stray. The others laughed politely. I smiled back, but inside, something coiled. They thought they were still writing the script. What they didn't know was that I'd already begun rewriting the ending. Dinner continued like a performance. Silverware clinked, wine poured, and small talk floated like perfume, thin and artificial. But beneath the tablecloth politeness, tension pulsed like a quiet drum. Then Evelyn brought it up. Have any of you heard more about the buyer? She said casually, slicing into her duck confit with calculated ease. Ashcroft Plaza. I heard the deal is nearly closed. That name. Ashcroft Plaza. Their pride. Their monument. Preston scoffed. Whoever they are, they've got deep pockets and no class. Probably some hedge fund trying to make a statement. I kept my eyes on my plate, swirling the wine slowly, letting their words roll over me like a familiar tide. They're being oddly secretive, Cassandra chimed in. Not even the brokers know who's behind West Pine Holdings. Creepy, don't you think? West Pine Holdings? Creepy, isn't it? Cassandra's voice was laced with mockery. None of them knew West Pine was born in a shoebox apartment, under a different name. Mine. Not the name I was given. The one I earned. Victoria Lane, West Pine Holdings, the company I built, the empire I designed from behind locked doors and silent signatures. They didn't know the woman they were gossiping about was sitting right in front of them, cutting her lamb in calm, precise strokes, like she wasn't rewriting their future under their own roof. And I said nothing, because silence was power. I had spent a decade building something they couldn't trace back to me. I hid behind clean shell companies, offshore trusts, whispered negotiations. Not out of fear, out of choice. Because once, just once, I wanted to be seen for who I was. Not the girl who needed the Ashcroft name to matter. I didn't want their approval as a businesswoman. I wanted their respect as a daughter. But I never got it. I still remember the day I came to Evelyn with my first proposal. Years ago, fresh out of grad school, hopeful, burning with ambition. She barely looked up from her tea. Darling, our family doesn't build. We own. There's a difference. That was the moment I stopped asking for space at their table and started building my own. Now here we were, years later, and they didn't realize they were already tenants of the daughter they once dismissed. They thought the power still belonged to them. What they didn't know was that I held the deed. Ashcroft Plaza wasn't just a building. It was the Ashcroft legacy, engraved in glass and steel, towering over the city like a crown forged by generations. And now, that crown sat quietly in my vault. I raised my glass, catching Evelyn's reflection in the crimson swirl. She didn't blink. She didn't know. To new beginnings, I murmured, soft enough to be missed, but loud enough for the silence to remember. The night after that dinner, I stood by my hotel window, watching the city blink like a giant machine, uncaring, relentless, alive. The Ashcrofts still believed they were the only ones who could shape skylines, but long before I stepped back into that gilded dining room, I had been building one of my own. In silence, in shadow. I still remember the first apartment. Crown Heights, Brooklyn. A one-bedroom walk-up with paper-thin walls and a heater that groaned louder than the subway. I slept beside spreadsheets and ramen cups, too broke for curtains, but too stubborn to quit. That place smelled like dust, ambition, and burning hope. West Pine Holdings didn't begin with capital. It began with rejection. The first bank laughed me out the door. No guarantor, no family collateral, no track record. Just a girl with a binder full of market analysis and eyes that refused to look away. I walked out, heart pounding, dignity torn. But I walked out standing. I pitched, revised, pitched again. Sleepless nights, 37 cold emails, 5 ignored calls, 1 predatory offer I tore in half. And then, a break. A single investor who said yes. Not because he believed in me, but because he didn't believe I could make it far enough to be a threat. That was his mistake. That first deal, a crumbling pre-war building near Prospect Park. Ugly, underpriced, overlooked. I saw potential. I saw bones that could hold an empire. I signed the contract with trembling fingers. Not out of fear, but reverence. It was the first signature that was fully mine. No mother's name, no father's credit, no borrowed clout, just me, Victoria Ashcroft. And with that, West Pine was born. No ribbon cutting, no champagne, just a girl with chipped nails, a maxed-out Metro card, and a fire that wouldn't go out. I built in silence, property by property, trust by trust, name by name, never mine. I watched as my net worth grew in shadows, as developers started whispering about a new player. Aggressive, anonymous, smart. They didn't know I was the ghost in the room. The invisible rival. The Ashcroft, who didn't need the family name to make her mark. And all the while, my family continued their masquerade, clinking glasses, buying horses, shuffling trust funds like playing cards. Never wondering what became of the daughter who vanished. Let them sip their wine. Let them toast to dynasties. Because in the shadows, I wasn't just building a company. I was building a legacy, brick by brick, to eclipse the one they denied me. I used to think that my return would come with thunder, headlines, gasps, earthquakes beneath the marble floors. But no. It started quietly, almost too quietly. A few weeks after that dinner, whispers began, not at cocktail parties, but in boardrooms. A preliminary audit notice, West Pine Holdings requesting a full review of Ashcroft assets. No one panicked. Not yet. A routine check, they said. Probably due diligence. Maybe gearing up for a joint venture. But I knew better. I had waited 10 years for this moment. And I wasn't knocking. I was walking straight through the front door, armed with paperwork sharp enough to carve cracks into an empire. Because if there's one thing I've learned from years of being dismissed, power doesn't need to shout. Sometimes it just arrives in a crisp white envelope. And just like that, the cracks began to show. Monday morning came like a curtain being yanked open. Too bright, too sharp, and far too soon. I returned to Ashcroft Plaza just before 8 a.m., unnoticed as always. No chauffeur, no announcement, no one waiting at the door. I still had the generic access badge they gave me when I first joined as Gerald's executive assistant. No one had ever bothered to deactivate it. That was the beauty of being invisible. I took the elevator up to the 32nd floor, settled into my usual spot near the end of the boardroom table, and waited. The email appeared while I was sitting in the office, clinical, concise, and colder than the gray sky outside the 32nd floor window. Pursuant to the preliminary MOU, West Pine Holdings formally requests a full financial audit of all assets currently held and managed by Ashcroft Holdings. There was no warning, no polite phone call, just one sentence that split the family like a blade. By noon, the Ashcrofts had assembled in the executive conference room, faces drawn tight, voices tense beneath the practiced calm. My father, Gerald, tried to downplay it with the authority of a man who'd survived recessions, lawsuits, even government scrutiny. "It's standard procedure," he said, fingers steepled in front of him. "A technicality. We've dealt with worse." But his voice trembled at the edges, like an old building hiding cracks behind expensive wallpaper. Preston wasn't buying it. "They don't just audit you for sport," he snapped, flipping through the notice. "Someone's digging. Someone wants in." He was right, but he didn't know how close he was. Cassandra, poised, vicious, always the snake in silk, sipped her espresso and offered a tight smile. "We haven't done anything illegal," she said, too smoothly. "But if someone wanted to find something, they might." That was her way of saying, "We've got skeletons. Let's pray they stay buried." And Evelyn, well, she didn't say much. She never did when real storms hit, just stared at the audit letter like it was a death certificate, and quietly ordered her assistant to start shredding anything dated before 2019. No one asked me anything, as always. I was the ghost in the room, present, ignored, politely tolerated. They never even considered that I might know what was happening, because none of them had dared to think of me. Not me as a threat. But it was me who initiated the audit. Not to destroy them, not yet, but to shake them. To remind them that the empire they built wasn't as airtight as they liked to believe. I knew their weak spots. Preston's shadow loans disguised as overseas partnerships. Evelyn's charitable funds that doubled as hush money. Even Father's hidden liabilities, covered by old favors and older threats. I didn't need to expose them. I just needed them to feel exposed. A single whisper, audit, can unnerve an entire boardroom faster than a scandal. Not because there's guilt, but because there's fear. Fear that something might be found, that the wrong eyes might look too long or too deep, and fear makes powerful people stupid. While Preston scrambled to stall the auditors, and Cassandra tried to reframe the narrative internally, I got a text from my lead attorney at West Pine. They're rattled. Do we initiate phase 2? I typed back, not yet, let them sweat. See, when you make your enemies question each other, you don't need to attack. You just wait, while the cracks widen on their own. It was a Tuesday morning, gray, damp, and heavier than most. The kind of morning where even the city traffic seemed to slow down in anticipation. I still remember the hush that fell over the boardroom at Ashcroft Plaza the moment I stepped through the glass doors. Everyone was there. Preston sat near the head of the table, scrolling through his phone, his brow furrowed as if annoyed by the inconvenience. Evelyn perched like a queen, her pearl necklace stiff as her smile. Beside her was my father, hollow-eyed, absent in spirit. Around them sat shareholders, department heads, and 2 lawyers trying too hard not to look nervous. I hadn't been formally invited to this meeting, not at first. But then again, no one expected the largest shareholder to walk in unannounced. They had no idea. Preston looked up and something in his face flickered. We had spoken at the garden party last week, a conversation drenched in subtext. But this was different. His eyes narrowed as if he could see the shift in my posture, the confidence in my steps, the subtle power I now carried. The navy suit he wore still screamed ambition, but the smirk he usually wore had thinned. I didn't sit. I walked to the center of the room, placed my folder on the table, and let my hand rest there. Good morning, I said, my voice even. Before we proceed with today's agenda, I believe there's something the board deserves to hear. Preston opened his mouth, probably to protest, but I raised a hand, calm but firm. Save it, I said. This won't take long. But it will change everything. I opened the folder. Inside were documents, not just any documents, but a thorough audit conducted over the past 2 years. Conducted quietly, methodically. Names, dates, transactions, unauthorized consulting fees. Inflated vendor contracts, shell companies owned by Evelyn, fabricated forecasts approved by Preston. Diversion of funds into personal real estate ventures. I didn't dramatize it. I simply read. Page 7, I said, flipping the sheet. Q3 disbursements, $4.2 million unaccounted for, redirected to a Greenwell Holdings, which, upon legal tracing, leads to an address in the Hamptons registered under Evelyn Ashcroft's maiden name. A silence fell so deep I could hear someone's watch ticking. I turned another page. Page 11, internal memo from Preston, authorizing a fake supplier deal for AI integration. Non-existent product, fully billed, with kickbacks routed to a private account in Zurich. Preston stood abruptly. This is outrageous, he barked. You have no jurisdiction to— I have more than jurisdiction, I interrupted. I have ownership. I pulled out the final page, a share certificate transfer, signed and sealed by one of the founding partners 5 years ago. The moment I slid it onto the table, a collective inhale swept through the room. My father shifted in his seat. His lips parted, then closed again. A cough rose in his throat, but he swallowed it. Evelyn stared at the certificate like it was written in another language. "You thought I was invisible," I said quietly. "You thought I'd stay tucked away in a corner, silent, forgotten. But I've been watching, learning, building." I looked straight at Preston. "You may have thought I was naive," I said. "But you were lazy, and arrogance is always sloppy." His jaw clenched, but he said nothing. I turned to the rest of the room. "These are not accusations. These are facts. And from today onward, this company will no longer operate on illusion, intimidation, or inherited privilege." My hands were steady, my breath even. For the first time in years, I wasn't shrinking to fit their story of me. I was rewriting it. I could feel the temperature in the room drop, the weight of shock pressing down on every pair of shoulders. But beneath that silence, something else stirred. Respect, maybe fear, or simply the inevitability of truth coming home. This wasn't about revenge. Not yet. This was the unveiling. The truth had a name now, and it was mine. There was a moment of silence after I finished speaking, thick and suffocating, like a curtain that had just fallen on a play no one expected to end this way. The kind of silence that doesn't wait for a reply. It demands a reckoning. Then Evelyn stood, her chair scraping back sharply across the polished floor. "You ungrateful little witch!" She spat. Her voice cracked with disbelief, but her anger was razor-sharp. "You've betrayed your own blood, your family, after everything we did for you." She slammed her hand on the table, and the pearls around her neck snapped, scattering across the floor like broken promises. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. The room was hers, just for a second. And then it wasn't. "I never betrayed this family," I said, my voice steady, even. "The family betrayed itself, long before I ever raised my voice." The words landed like a gavel, final, echoing, and undeniable. Evelyn's mouth opened slightly, but no more words came. It wasn't rage that filled her eyes now. It was something closer to recognition, the terrible recognition of truth. Her shoulders sagged just slightly, and she looked older than I had ever seen her. Preston sat frozen, jaw clenched, his knuckles white on the edge of the table. His phone lay untouched beside him, for once. My father's eyes were downcast, fixed on the printed reports in front of him, as if they could somehow rewrite themselves. But they couldn't. Nothing could. I walked slowly to the head of the table, the seat that had always belonged to someone else, someone louder, someone unquestioned, someone male. But I didn't ask. I just sat down, because I no longer needed permission. "This isn't revenge," I said, placing my hand gently over the folder. "This is responsibility. If anything, it's mercy." "Mercy?" Evelyn gasped. "You humiliated us in public. You brought outsiders into a private matter. You tarnished our name." "Our name was tarnished," I said calmly. "The day you let lies drive policy. The day corners were cut, audits disappeared, and loyal employees were discarded for short-term profits. The Ashcroft name didn't fall today. It's been crumbling for years. I just stopped pretending not to see it." No one interrupted me. No one could. "This company doesn't belong to corruption, to secrets, to dynasties," I continued. "It belongs to every honest person who ever walked through its doors, hoping to build something meaningful. I'm not here to burn the house down. I'm here to rebuild it on something real." Preston stood up suddenly. "So what's next?" he snapped. "You turn this place into some charity project? Fire all of us? Replace us with ethics consultants? Rewrite history with yourself as the heroine?" I raised an eyebrow. "History doesn't need to be rewritten. It needs to be told truthfully, even when it's uncomfortable. As for you, you'll stay, but your role will change. You'll answer to an independent oversight committee. Every financial move you make will be reviewed, every contract double-checked. You'll still work here, but under scrutiny, the kind you never expected to face." He opened his mouth to object but said nothing. His jaw clicked shut like a trap. His silence wasn't compliance. It was fear. "You're not strong enough to lead this company," Evelyn said, voice cracking. "You're just a girl with a grudge and a lucky break." I smiled. Not bitterly, just honestly. "I used to believe that too," I said. That strength came from power, from being louder, tougher, more ruthless. But I learned something else. Real strength is quiet. It listens. It lasts. And it doesn't need to shout to be heard. They didn't yell anymore, not Evelyn, not Preston, not even my father. Because truth, when spoken plainly, doesn't need volume. It simply stands. And in that moment, I stood with it. I looked around the table at the people who had once shaped my silence, who mocked me with polite smiles, who thought their control over the company meant control over the narrative. But not anymore. This wasn't about tearing them down. That would have been too easy. And too small. This was about holding up a mirror they couldn't look away from. I gathered the report slowly, letting the weight of silence settle again. But this time, it was mine. "This is not the end of Ashcroft and Vale," I said, standing. "But it is the end of how you used to run it." My father looked up at last, and when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "You're really doing this?" I met his eyes. Not with anger, not with resentment, but with something deeper. Certainty. "I already did," I said. I walked toward the door, but paused before leaving. Then, quietly, almost as if to myself, I added, "You think I did this to punish you, but I didn't. I did it so that 10 years from now, when someone else is sitting in this room, they'll know what integrity looks like, and they'll know it didn't start with you. It started the moment I stopped letting silence protect your sins." And with that, I left them behind. Not with vengeance, but with clarity. The past didn't define me anymore. But it had finally answered to me. The meeting paused, like a sharp breath in the middle of a storm. 15 minutes. For them, it was time to whisper and scheme. For me, it was a moment to see people for who they truly were. Stepping out of the boardroom, I walked into the quiet corridor. The storm had passed, but it wasn't over. Not yet. People often think silence is weakness, that if you don't speak up, you've accepted your place beneath their feet. But I've learned this. When silence is a choice, it's not surrender. It's strategy. I stayed silent for 10 years, not out of fear, but because I was building. Quietly, carefully, one layer at a time. I didn't want to tear this company down. I wanted to rebuild it. Differently. I remember standing outside these very meetings, holding coffee for men who never remembered my name. Once, Evelyn laughed and said, "She looks more like a barista than an Ashcroft." I smiled politely, but something inside me turned cold. Not from hate, but from resolve. I never wanted revenge. I wanted reform. Real power doesn't shout. It stands still. It listens. It knows when to wait and when to act. While they talked, I observed. And I saw what others missed. The cracks beneath the surface, the decay behind the marble. So I started investing, not in titles, but in people. The quiet engineers, the overlooked interns, the single moms in HR who did brilliant work without ever asking for credit. They became the future I chose to believe in. I don't care about preserving a family name. I care about building something better, a place where ethics matter more than ego, and talent speaks louder than lineage. That's why I didn't fire everyone today. That would have been easy. But I don't want vengeance. I want change. Not just punishment. Prevention. Some might call me naive. They say the world doesn't run on kindness or principle, but I've seen what happens when power grows too fast without a moral backbone. It collapses. So I'll build slowly, but I'll build right. Because I believe in sustainable leadership, in doing the right thing, even when no one's watching. Honor doesn't come from a last name. It comes from action. And that's the legacy I'm fighting for. Not just for myself, but for every woman who's ever been dismissed, overlooked, or told to stay in her lane. Today, I didn't just shift the direction of this company. I redefined what it means to lead it. I returned to the boardroom after a few minutes of silence. Most of them were still there, no longer posturing, no longer barking, just quiet, uncertain, and for once, listening. I stood at the head of the table again. No folder this time, no evidence, just truth. I'm not here to destroy anyone, I began, voice calm. If that were my goal, I would have done it differently, publicly, brutally, but that's not what this company needs, and it's not what I want. They watched me warily, as if unsure whether I was still a threat or now something worse, a mirror. You have a choice, I continued, all of you. I let the weight of those words settle before I went on. You can choose to rebuild this company with me. Honestly, transparently, from the ground up. No more backroom deals, no more name games, no more pretending to be something we're not. I paused, then looked at each of them, one by one. Or you can walk away, and everything you once had, the access, the authority, the illusion of control, goes with you, I said evenly. The room tightened like a held breath. This is not a threat, I added gently. It's an invitation, but it's also the last one you'll get. Across the table, Preston shifted in his seat. You want us to roll over, he muttered. Let you play queen while we smile and nod. No, I replied. I want you to do the thing you should have done years ago. Earn your place. Evelyn scoffed, folding her arms like a shield. You think people forget betrayal just because you say it wasn't personal? It was personal, I said, meeting her eyes. That's why it matters. This family made it personal the moment it decided only certain names deserved to be heard, the moment it chose image over integrity. I'm just giving you a way out, a way forward. But you'll have to meet me there, honestly. My father said nothing for a long time. Then finally, quietly, what would that even look like? I nodded, expecting the question. It starts with full cooperation, a clean audit, transparency with every department, new ethics protocols, a board that includes outside voices, not just family, and a long, painful look at how we got here. No golden parachutes? Preston asked bitterly. No illusions, I answered. You can still be part of this, if you're willing to change. There was a beat of silence. Then Evelyn stood, but this time slowly. I won't be part of this performance, she said stiffly. Let the vultures have what's left. And she walked out, her heels echoing down the hallway like a closing chapter. Preston stayed seated, but his jaw was clenched. You're bluffing, he muttered. You can't do this without us. I looked at him and smiled, just a little. I already am. It wasn't a declaration of victory. It was a simple statement of fact. Then something unexpected happened. My Uncle James, a man I hadn't heard speak more than a dozen words to me in my life, cleared his throat. I was wrong about you, he said. The room turned toward him. I thought you were just quiet, soft, a ghost in the background. He looked down, then back up. But you were watching, learning. That's not weakness, that's strength. He stood. You have my support. My father remained silent at first, eyes heavy, shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in shame. Finally, he spoke. If you're still willing to have me, I want to learn. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He knew it had to be earned. As for my brother, he scoffed, cold, dismissive. You think this makes you better than us? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. My offer still stood. And in that moment, the path forward split. One chose growth. The other, exile. I didn't force either. I simply let the truth do its work. This wasn't just a company coup. It was a moral line in the sand. I offered no ultimatums, only choices. And for the first time in years, I watched the Ashcroft legacy, the real one, begin to shift. Not with applause, not with fireworks, but with quiet accountability. A new era doesn't always begin with noise. Sometimes it begins with a single sentence, The past ends here. What we build next is up to us. The boardroom was never the same after that day. Some left, unwilling to adapt, unable to let go of the old power games. Others stayed, not out of loyalty to me, but because something deeper had shifted. The realization that the past was no longer sustainable. That partnership was the only path forward, or they'd find themselves in exile, not just from the company, but from relevance. But it wasn't over, not even close. The real work was just beginning. We started with audits. Painful, honest ones. I brought in external voices, not tied to the Ashcroft name, to help rebuild what we had allowed to rot. We rewrote our policies. We dismantled golden parachutes. We held space for exit interviews and anonymous testimonies. The hardest part wasn't the resistance. It was the silence, the kind that came after decades of pretense. You don't erase a culture overnight. You replace it, slowly, brick by brick. And while the board wrestled with new governance and tighter oversight, the world outside was catching up fast. It started with whispers, then blogs, then front-page stories. Victoria Lane Unmasked, the ghost investor of Crown Heights, is Ashcroft's quiet architect. From secretary to stakeholder, the woman who rebuilt a legacy. For years, I'd existed in footnotes, a silent presence, filed under support staff or mystery investor. Now I was suddenly the story. They asked who I really was. Some called it a revenge arc. Others romanticized it into a business fairy tale. But I didn't give interviews. I didn't correct the record. I didn't need the narrative, because I already had the truth. Instead, I put my focus on something far less glamorous. Space. Not corporate, not metaphorical, real, physical space. I proposed something radical, that we dismantle the Ashcroft Executive Plaza, once the crown jewel of elite networking and marble ego, and rebuild it into a public commons. A place for people. A place for those we once overlooked. The shareholders balked, PR teams panicked. But I held firm. Legacy isn't what you leave behind when you're gone. It's what you make possible while you're here. We rezoned the building, hired local architects, invited community leaders to the planning table. 6 months later, on a gray spring morning, I returned to the site. The towering golden nameplate had been removed. No more Ashcroft and Vale etched into stone. In its place, a modest sign with clean lines, the Commons, and beneath it, built for people, not power. Inside, where glossy conference rooms once gleamed under chandelier light, now stood open classrooms, art spaces, and a co-op kitchen. Upstairs, vocational training centers. Downstairs, free childcare. And on the rooftop, solar panels feeding energy back into the neighborhood grid. But it was the back courtyard that mattered most to me. That's where the garden would grow. A few volunteers were laying soil and preparing raised beds. A child was laughing in the distance. A young woman with work gloves and bright eyes approached me, holding a single red clay brick. "Would you like to do the honors?" she asked. I nodded. I knelt, knees pressing into the earth. My fingers closed around the brick, solid, plain, unmarked. I pressed it down into place. Not ceremoniously, just firmly, purposefully. And in that motion, quiet, grounded, I felt the weight of a decade lift. The lies, the marginalization, the boardroom wars, the endless waiting to be seen. Gone. Not forgotten, not forgiven. But transformed. Someone snapped a photo. Others clapped politely. I didn't pose. I didn't smile. I just brushed the dirt from my hands and stood up. That's when I saw her. A woman about my age, holding her son's hand. She hesitated before stepping forward. "Excuse me, are you Victoria Lane?" I nodded. "My son's starting the after-school program here next week," she said, voice cracking a little. "We couldn't afford anything else. I just wanted to say thank you." I glanced down at the boy, who peeked at me shyly from behind her coat. "I'm glad he's here," I said softly. She smiled. "Why did you do all this?" I looked behind me, at the garden beds, the open doors, the building that once reeked of exclusivity, but now breathed possibility. And I answered her honestly, because truth deserves a place to grow too. She didn't ask anything else. She just nodded and walked away. And I walked home, quietly. No headlines, no applause, just the sound of a city. Dis, and maybe a legacy, beginning to change, one brick at a time.